April 18, 1942, Tokyo. The air raid sirens wailed across the imperial capital like wounded animals, their mechanical screams cutting through the midday calm. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka stood frozen on the rooftop of the Naval Intelligence Headquarters, his binoculars trained on the western sky. He had been assured, promised by his superiors, by the engineers, by the very architects of Japan's defensive network, that no American bomber could reach the home islands. The mathematics were simple, incontrovertible. The nearest Allied airfields lay thousands of miles away, far beyond the range of any known aircraft. Yet there they were, 16 silver specks glinting in the spring sunlight, their twin-engine silhouettes unmistakable against the scattered clouds. B-29 Mitchells, impossibly, audaciously present over the heart of the empire. Tanaka's hands trembled, not from fear of the bombs, the physical damage would be minimal, he knew, but from the implications. If the Americans could reach Tokyo now, with medium bombers launched from carriers in a desperate gambit, what would they bring tomorrow? What technological marvel was already taking shape in the vast industrial complexes of a nation that produced more steel in a single month than Japan could manufacture in a year? The answer to that question would arrive 2 years later, heralded not by sirens but by silence, a silence so complete, so absolute, that it preceded the bombers like a death sentence. The radar operators would see nothing, the coastal watchers would report nothing, and then, from altitudes so extreme that the human eye could barely perceive them, the B-29 Superfortresses would appear, not as aircraft, but as silver needles stitching destruction across the fabric of Japanese cities. They would fly beyond the reach of fighters, beyond the range of anti-aircraft guns, beyond the very conception of what aviation technology could achieve. And Japanese officers, trained in the Bushido code to face death without flinching, would discover a new kind of terror, the terror of technological obsolescence, of fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity rendered courage itself irrelevant. This is the story of how American engineering created a weapon so advanced it shattered not just cities, but the psychological foundations of Japanese military confidence. This is the story of the B-29 Superfortress and the men who watched helplessly as it rewrote the rules of warfare from altitudes where the air itself was too thin to breathe. In the years preceding the Pacific War, Japanese military aviation had been the envy of Asia. The Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940, dominated the skies over China with a combination of speed, maneuverability, and range that outclassed every Allied fighter it encountered. Japanese pilots, rigorously trained and imbued with the warrior ethos of their samurai ancestors, believed themselves invincible. They had studied the reports from Europe, where German Stukas and Messerschmitts had crushed the antiquated air forces of Poland and France. They had watched American newsreels showing cumbersome B-17s lumbering across European skies, vulnerable to fighter attack, bleeding crews over hostile territory. The Japanese High Command concluded that air warfare was ultimately a contest of pilot skill and aircraft agility. Numbers might matter in a prolonged conflict, but Japan's early victories, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, would deliver such a decisive blow that America would sue for peace before its industrial machine could fully mobilize. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the most experienced carrier strike force in the world. Japanese torpedo bombers had perfected shallow water attack techniques that American naval planners had deemed impossible. The surprise assault on Pearl Harbor demonstrated technological sophistication and operational daring that stunned Washington. For 6 months, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with a speed and coordination that seemed to validate every assumption about Yamato, superiority, and Western decadence. But the men planning Japan's conquest had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had confused tactical brilliance with strategic sustainability. They had assumed that American industrial capacity, while vast, would be slow to mobilize, vulnerable to early defeats, and ultimately demoralized by the warrior spirit of Japan's fighting men. They had not understood, could not understand, the nature of the adversary they had awakened. America in 1941 was not simply a nation with factories. It was a nation whose entire culture had been shaped by industrial abundance, by a democratic ethos that valued innovation over tradition, by an immigrant population that brought technological expertise from every corner of Europe. When those factories turned from producing Chevrolets and Frigidaires to building bombers and battleships, they would do so with an efficiency that bordered on the incomprehensible. The B-29 Superfortress did not emerge from a single moment of inspiration. It was the product of years of development, of lessons learned from the European Air War, of engineering challenges that pushed American industry to the very limits of its capabilities. The United States Army Air Forces had begun conceptualizing a long-range heavy bomber as early as 1938. When strategists recognized that future wars might require striking targets thousands of miles from friendly bases, the initial specifications seemed almost fantastical. A bomber that could carry a 5-ton bomb load for 5,000 miles, cruise at 30,000 feet, defend itself with remotely controlled gun turrets, and maintain a pressurized cabin for its crew. In 1938, no aircraft in the world came close to meeting even half those requirements. Boeing's engineers took on the challenge with characteristic American audacity. They designed an aircraft that was less a conventional bomber and more a flying technological laboratory. The B-29 would be the first production aircraft with a fully pressurized cabin, allowing crews to operate at altitudes where enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns became irrelevant. It would be powered by 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. Engines so advanced and temperamental that they would require constant refinement throughout the war. The aircraft would span 141 feet from wingtip to wingtip, stretching 99 feet from nose to tail, weighing 74,000 pounds empty and 135,000 pounds at maximum takeoff weight. It would cruise at 230 miles per hour at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the air temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the atmospheric pressure made unprotected human survival impossible. The first prototype flew on September 21, 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor. Test pilot Eddie Allen pushed the massive aircraft into the sky above Boeing Field in Seattle, and for 25 minutes, the B-29 performed flawlessly. It was a triumph of American engineering, a demonstration that the impossible specifications could be translated into functioning reality. But the development process would prove far from smooth. The Wright engines overheated catastrophically during testing, causing fires that destroyed several prototypes. The aircraft's complex systems, its remote-controlled gun turrets, its pressurization equipment, its high-altitude fuel management, required constant troubleshooting. On February 18, 1943, Eddie Allen himself died when a B-29 prototype suffered an engine fire and crashed into a Seattle meatpacking plant, killing 31 people total. Any normal weapons program would have been canceled. The cost overruns were staggering. The technical problems seemed insurmountable. The aircraft was already obsolete by European standards, where daylight bombing was proving suicidally expensive, and British bombers were shifting to night operations. But General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, understood what was at stake. The distances of the Pacific Theater meant that without a super long-range bomber, American forces would be condemned to an island-hopping campaign that could take decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The B-29 was not merely desirable, it was strategically essential. Arnold ordered full production to begin even before testing was complete, a decision that would eventually cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, and involved 1,700 subcontractors across the United States. By the spring of 1944, B-29s began arriving in the China-Burma-India theater, operating from bases around Chengdu. The logistics were mind-boggling. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayas, the hump, in C-46 and C-47 transport aircraft, a supply chain so tenuous that it took 12 tons of fuel delivered to China to put 1 ton into a B-29's tanks. The crews called it the most expensive fuel in history. The first B-29 mission against the Japanese home islands launched on June 15, 1944, targeting the Imperial Iron and Steel Works in Yawata on the southern island of Kyushu. 68 B-29s participated. Only 47 reached the target. The damage was negligible, but something had changed. Japanese radar operators, scanning their screens in the early morning darkness, had detected formations approaching from the southwest. The altitude readings made no sense. The incoming aircraft were flying at 28,000 feet, far above the effective ceiling of Japan's interceptor fighters. The Kawasaki Ki-45. Nick could barely reach 25,000 feet in combat configuration. The vaunted Zero, stripped of armor and ammunition to reduce weight, might struggle to 26,000 feet, where its controls became mushy and its guns unreliable. Against the B-29s cruising serenely at 30,000 feet or higher, Japanese fighters were reduced to spectators. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly upward, their shells detonating thousands of feet below the bomber formations. The Japanese had prepared for an air war fought at medium altitudes where courage and skill could compensate for numerical disadvantages. The B-29 rendered that preparation irrelevant. Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring fighter aces with 64 confirmed kills, later wrote of his first encounter with a B-29 formation over Tokyo. He had coaxed his Zero to its maximum altitude, the engine coughing and sputtering in the thin air, the controls barely responsive. He could see the bombers above him, their contrails etching white lines across the blue sky, perfectly out of reach. He tried diving to build speed, then pulling up in a steep climb to gain those final few thousand feet. The Zero stalled, tumbling sideways, and Sakai barely recovered in time to avoid spinning into the city below. When he looked up again, the B-29s were gone, their bombs already released, their crews drinking coffee and pressurized comfort while Japanese pilots gasped for oxygen and wrestled with frozen controls. It was not war, Sakai wrote. It was execution. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese military culture had been built on centuries of warrior tradition, on the belief that spiritual strength and martial skill could overcome material disadvantages. The samurai had faced Mongol invasions and emerged victorious. The Meiji Restoration had demonstrated Japan's ability to rapidly modernize and defeat Western powers like Russia. The early Pacific War victories seemed to confirm that Japanese determination could triumph over American softness and industrial excess. The B-29 shattered that narrative. Here was a weapon that made courage irrelevant, that rendered pilot skill meaningless, that demonstrated American technological superiority in the most visceral way possible. A Japanese fighter pilot might spend years mastering his craft, perfecting his marksmanship, studying aerial tactics, and none of it mattered when the enemy flew beyond his aircraft's physical capabilities. The raids intensified throughout the summer and fall of 1944. In October, American forces captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, providing bases from which B-29s could reach Japan with full bomb loads and fighter escort. The logistics that had crippled operations from China evaporated. Concrete runways, capable of handling the B-29's massive weight, stretched across Pacific islands that had been coral atolls 6 months earlier. CBs, the Navy's construction battalions, performed miracles of engineering. building entire air bases from scratch in a matter of weeks. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement crews arrived by ship in quantities that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. American submarines had already strangled Japan's merchant marine, cutting the home islands off from their conquered territories. Now the B-29s would cut the home islands themselves to pieces. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29s launched from the Marianas against Tokyo, the first of what would become daily raids. They flew in broad daylight, their polished aluminum skins glinting in the sun, impervious to interception. Japanese civilians watched from the ground as the formations droned overhead at altitudes where even their engine sound was muted. Air raid sirens wailed uselessly. There was nowhere to hide from bombs dropped from 6 miles up. The psychological effect was devastating. Every Japanese citizen had been told that the home islands were inviolate, protected by an invincible military, shielded by the divine wind, kamikaze, that had saved Japan from the Mongols 7 centuries earlier. Now the Americans came and went as they pleased, destroying war factories, burning cities, killing thousands, and suffering minimal losses. In the winter of 1944, Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay was a tactical genius with a reputation for ruthlessness. He had pioneered bomber formation tactics over Europe that reduced losses while improving accuracy. He studied the B-29 operations and recognized their inefficiency. High-altitude precision bombing was proving no more effective over Japan than it had been over Germany. Cloud cover obscured targets. High winds at altitude, the jet stream, not yet fully understood, scattered bomb patterns across miles. The elaborate Norden bomb sites, so prized by American bomber crews, were nearly useless in Pacific weather conditions. Something had to change. LeMay made a decision that shocked his subordinates. The B-29s would attack at night, from low altitude, stripped of most of their defensive armament, to carry maximum incendiary loads. They would abandon the high-altitude sanctuary that had made them invulnerable and come down to 5,000 feet, within range of anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. But they would attack Japanese cities not with high-explosive bombs intended for steel and concrete, but with incendiaries designed to ignite the wood and paper construction that characterized Japanese urban housing. They would create firestorms. The first test of LeMay's new tactics came on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945. 334 B-29s, each carrying 7 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, converged on Tokyo. They arrived after midnight. Pathfinder aircraft marking the target area with napalm bombs that created an X of flame visible from 50 miles away. The following waves dropped their incendiaries in a carefully planned pattern designed to trap hundreds of thousands of civilians in a ring of fire. The M69 clusters broke apart at 2,000 feet, scattering 47 individual bomblets that ignited on impact, spraying jellied gasoline that stuck to everything it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What followed was the single most destructive conventional bombing raid in history. The fires merged into a conflagration that generated its own weather system. Superheated air rose so rapidly that it created hurricane-force winds at ground level, winds that sucked people into the flames, that uprooted trees, that turned entire neighborhoods into blast furnaces. The Sumida River boiled. People who jumped into canals and water tanks seeking refuge were cooked alive as the water temperature rose past 140 degrees. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people died in a single night, more than would die from either atomic bomb. 1 million people were rendered homeless. The B-29 crews, flying through smoke that rose to 15,000 feet, reported that the smell of burning flesh penetrated their pressurized cabins. Bombardier Chester Marshall later recalled, "The stench was so bad, we wore our oxygen masks even though we were at low altitude. It wasn't smoke. It was the smell of death, roasted human beings. And it followed us back to the Marianas. The Tokyo firebombing was followed by similar raids against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities. By June 1945, LeMay's crews were running out of targets. 66 Japanese cities had been subjected to systematic incendiary attack. Industrial production had collapsed. The rail network was in ruins. Millions of civilians had fled to the countryside, abandoning the urban centers that had been the engines of Japanese modernization. The B-29s flew over Japanese cities in broad daylight, dropping leaflets warning civilians to evacuate before the next raid, demonstrating the complete helplessness of Japan's air defenses. American losses remained remarkably light. Japanese anti-aircraft guns and night fighters destroyed fewer than 1% of the B-29s dispatched on these missions. For Japanese military officers, the B-29 campaign was a humiliation beyond comprehension. They had been trained to believe in the superiority of spirit over material, in the Japanese warrior's ability to overcome any obstacle through dedication and sacrifice. They had been told that American pilots were soft, that American soldiers would break when faced with determined resistance, that American society, decadent, diverse, obsessed with comfort, would lack the will to accept casualties in a distant Pacific war. Every B-29 raid refuted that propaganda. The Americans came with a machine so advanced that Japanese fighters could barely reach it, so well built that crews survived missions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, so numerous that losses were simply replaced from the production lines that delivered a new B-29 every 4 hours throughout 1945. The psychological impact extended beyond the military. Japanese civilians had endured years of propaganda, assuring them of inevitable victory, of the divine protection of the emperor, of the spiritual weakness of the enemy. The B-29 raids made clear that the war was lost, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, that the vaunted military could not even defend the home islands from destruction. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast was played on August 15, 1945, many Japanese soldiers and officers wept, not merely from the shame of defeat, but from the recognition that they had been utterly outmatched. They had fought bravely, skillfully, with a dedication and willingness to die that American forces both respected and feared. And it had made no difference. The B-29s had written the verdict in fire across 66 cities, and the atomic bombs delivered by the Enola Gay and Bockscar had merely punctuated a conclusion already determined. The B-29 raids had destroyed more than buildings. They had destroyed the ideology that justified Japan's empire, the narrative of racial superiority that had driven its conquests, the belief that spiritual strength could substitute for industrial capacity. Japanese officers had been terrified not because they feared death. Their culture had prepared them to die with honor, but because they recognized technological obsolescence. They had brought swords to a gunfight, and the gunfight had been conducted from altitudes where swords were not merely ineffective, but irrelevant. The B-29 represented a kind of warfare where individual heroism, tactical brilliance, and strategic positioning mattered far less than engineering excellence, industrial capacity, and scientific innovation. It was a future that Japan, for all its early victories, had never prepared for. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka survived the war. In the chaos of August 1945, as Japan's military structure disintegrated and Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast played on radios across the nation, Tanaka stood once more on the rooftop of Naval Intelligence Headquarters. The building had survived the firebombing of Tokyo, barely. The surrounding neighborhoods were ash and rubble, skeletal chimneys rising from the ruins like gravestones. The smell of smoke still lingered, weeks after the last raid. He looked up at the sky, that same sky where he had first spotted the Doolittle Raiders 3 years earlier. It was empty now, silent except for the distant drone of a single B-29 on a reconnaissance flight. its aluminum skin catching the late afternoon sun. Tanaka watched it cross the horizon, untouchable, serene, a silver needle stitching its path across the blue fabric of the sky. He thought of the young pilots who had died trying to reach that altitude, their zeros falling from the sky like broken birds. He thought of the civilians who had burned in the firestorms, who had believed the propaganda about inevitable victory and divine protection. He thought of the officers who had planned the war, who had assumed that courage and tradition could overcome industrial capacity and technological innovation. The B-29 disappeared beyond the horizon, headed back to the Marianas, where more of its kind waited on runways carved from coral and jungle. Thousands of them, Tanaka knew. Enough to burn every city in Japan twice over. Enough to make resistance not merely futile, but absurd. The Americans had not simply won a military victory. They had demonstrated a capacity for organized violence on a scale that made traditional warfare obsolete. They had fought not with samurai spirit, but with engineers' precision, turning their factories and laboratories into weapons as devastating as any bomb. In the months that followed, as American occupation forces arrived and began the work of rebuilding Japan, Tanaka watched with a mixture of shame and grudging respect. The same nation that had incinerated Tokyo now brought food to starving civilians. The same industrial machine that had produced B-29s at impossible speed now delivered medicine, building supplies, and agricultural equipment. American soldiers, who should have been brutal conquerors, instead distributed chocolate to children and helped clear rubble from the streets. It was bewildering, contradictory, impossible to reconcile with everything Tanaka had been taught about American decadence and moral weakness. One evening, walking through the ruins of his neighborhood, Tanaka encountered a young American engineer supervising the installation of a water pump. The man was perhaps 25, too young to have served in combat, probably a specialist sent over in the reconstruction effort. He saw Tanaka in his faded naval uniform and nodded respectfully. "Things will get better," he said in halting Japanese. "We'll help you rebuild." Tanaka stared at him, this representative of the nation that had just destroyed 66 Japanese cities, and saw not cruelty, but earnestness. The young engineer genuinely believed that reconstruction was possible, that past enemies could become future partners, that technology and industry could build as well as destroy. It was, Tanaka realized, the same optimism that had built the B-29. The same belief in progress, in the power of human ingenuity to solve problems, in the democratic ideal that ordinary people, engineers, workers, pilots, could achieve extraordinary things when properly organized and equipped. Japan had fought for empire, for racial hierarchy, for the preservation of ancient traditions and warrior codes. America had fought with assembly lines and slide rules and bomber crews who flew 35 missions and then went home to become accountants and teachers. And in that difference lay the explanation for everything that had happened. The B-29 Superfortress stands today as a monument to a particular kind of American power. Not the power of empire or conquest, but the power of industrial democracy. It was designed by engineers who believed that technical challenges could be solved through innovation and persistence. It was built by workers, many of them women, who riveted its aluminum skin and installed its complex systems in factories that operated around the clock. It was flown by crews drawn from every corner of American society, farmers and city boys, immigrant sons and Mayflower descendants, united by training and purpose rather than blood or tradition. The Japanese officers who watched those silver shapes pass overhead, beyond the reach of their fighters and guns, were not simply witnessing a new aircraft. They were witnessing the triumph of a social and economic system that could mobilize vast resources, harness cutting-edge technology, and deliver overwhelming force with mechanical precision. The B-29 was not merely a weapon, it was a statement. It said that free societies, with their messiness and diversity and emphasis on individual innovation, could outproduce and outfight authoritarian systems that relied on hierarchy, tradition, and spiritual mobilization. This was the terror that Japanese officers felt when B-29s appeared beyond radar range. It was not physical fear. Many of them had proven their courage in combat dozens of times. It was the fear of obsolescence, of fighting an enemy whose industrial and technological advantages made traditional military virtues irrelevant. It was the recognition that Japan had entered a war it could never win, against an adversary whose capacity for organized violence exceeded anything the samurai tradition had prepared them for. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the ashes of Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya, that message was written in fire and ash. The atomic bombs delivered by B-29s on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, were simply the final punctuation on a verdict already delivered by 8 months of systematic firebombing. Japan's cities had been destroyed. Its military was shattered. Its people were starving. And through it all, the B-29s had continued coming, untouchable, inevitable, the physical manifestation of American industrial might. The survivors of that campaign, both the Japanese civilians who endured the raids and the American crews who flew them, carried its lessons forward into the post-war world. Japan rebuilt as a democracy, abandoning the militaristic ideology that had driven its imperial expansion. The Japanese self-defense forces, when they were eventually formed, operated on principles of civilian control and defensive posture, a radical departure from the warrior culture that had dominated Japanese military thinking for centuries. The transformation was not simply a matter of defeat. It was recognition that the B-29 raids had demonstrated the futility of attempting to match American industrial capacity through spiritual mobilization or tactical brilliance. For America, the B-29 campaign in the Pacific foreshadowed the strategic bombing doctrines of the Cold War. The belief that air power alone could compel an enemy's surrender, that sufficient destruction of infrastructure and industry could break a nation's will to fight, became central to American military planning. The creation of the United States Air Force as an independent service in 1947 reflected the lessons of the B-29 campaign, that strategic bombing was not merely a support function, but a war-winning capability in its own right. But the B-29's legacy extends beyond military doctrine. It represents a moment when American engineering, American industrial capacity, and American democratic values converged to create something unprecedented. The engineers who designed it worked for companies where innovation was rewarded and failure was accepted as part of the development process. The workers who built it earned middle-class wages and union benefits, a labor system that contrasted sharply with the slave labor and forced mobilization that characterized Axis production. The crews who flew it were trained to make decisions, to adapt to changing circumstances, to exercise individual initiative, qualities that democratic societies cultivate and authoritarian systems suppress. This is why Japanese officers were terrified when B-29s appeared beyond radar range. They were not simply confronting a superior aircraft. They were confronting a superior system, a system that valued education over indoctrination, innovation over tradition, and the contributions of ordinary citizens over the dictates of military elites. The B-29 was the product of that system, and its appearance in the skies over Japan announced the obsolescence of everything the Japanese military establishment believed in. In the summer sky above Tokyo, that truth was written in contrails at 30,000 feet, in the drone of Wright R-3350 engines, in the silver shapes that glinted like needles in the sun. The B-29s came and went as they pleased, and there was nothing Japanese courage or skill or determination could do to stop them. The war had become not a contest of warriors, but a demonstration of industrial capacity. And in that contest, the outcome had never been in doubt. The terror Japanese officers felt was the terror of recognition. Recognition that they had fought bravely and skillfully for a lost cause, that their sacrifices had been in vain, that the enemy they had dismissed as soft and decadent possessed depths of strength they had never imagined. It was the terror of watching your world end, not with a dramatic final battle, but with the systematic, mechanical, remorseless destruction of everything you had fought to protect. It was the terror of knowing that the silver shapes passing overhead represented not just defeat, but the future. A future where Japan would have to abandon its imperial ambitions, its warrior ideology, its dreams of Asian hegemony, and instead learn to live in a world dominated by the very nation it had sought to humble. The B-29 Superfortress, flying beyond radar range, beyond fighter interception, beyond the reach of anti-aircraft fire, was more than an aircraft. It was prophecy made metal, a glimpse of the post-war world written in aluminum and fire. And for the Japanese officers who watched it pass overhead, untouchable and inevitable, it was the most terrifying sight imaginable. The future arriving ahead of schedule, demonstrating that everything they believed in was already obsolete, that the war was already over, and that all that remained was to count the cost of refusing to accept the inevitable. In the end, the terror was not about death. Japanese military culture had prepared its officers to die with honor. The terror was about meaninglessness, about the recognition that courage and sacrifice and tactical brilliance meant nothing when your enemy could simply fly above you, beyond your reach, and reduce your cities to ash with mechanical precision. The B-29 transformed warfare from a contest of warriors into a demonstration of industrial capacity. And in making that transformation, it rendered obsolete not just Japanese air defenses, but the entire ideology that had driven Japan to war. That silver shape, glinting in the high-altitude sun, untouchable and serene, was the symbol of America's triumph. Not triumph of arms alone, but triumph of a system that could harness technology, mobilize industry, and project power in ways that Japan, for all its early victories and martial spirit, could never match. The Japanese officers who watched those B-29s pass overhead were not simply witnessing defeat. They were witnessing the end of an era, the death of a worldview, and the arrival of a future they had never imagined. And in the terror of that recognition, in the helpless rage of watching an enemy you cannot reach systematically destroy everything you have fought to protect, lies one of the great truths of the Second World War, that technological superiority, backed by industrial capacity and democratic values, proved more decisive than courage, skill, or determination. The B-29 Superfortress delivered that truth from 30,000 feet, beyond radar range, beyond fighter interception, beyond everything the Japanese military had prepared for. And in delivering it, the B-29 did more than win a war. It announced the shape of the post-war world, where American power, industrial, technological, and ideological, would dominate the global order for generations to come. The silver shapes have long since vanished from the skies over Japan. The B-29s were retired, replaced by jets and missiles and satellites. But their legacy remains, written in the rebuilt cities of Japan, in the democratic institutions that emerged from defeat, in the recognition that the future belongs not to warriors, but to engineers, not to empires, but to industrial democracies, not to the sword, but to the slide rule. That is the truth that terrified Japanese officers when B-29s appeared beyond radar range. That is the truth that the silver shapes carried in their bomb bays and wrote across the Pacific sky. And that is the truth that echoes still, 70 years after the last B-29 made its final bombing run over a Japan that would never again threaten American power, never again challenge the industrial might that could produce a new superfortress every 4 hours, and never again forget the lesson taught by those untouchable shapes that flew beyond radar, beyond fighters, beyond hope itself. The lessons written in aluminum and fire above the Japanese home islands did not end with the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945. They continued to reverberate through the decades that followed, shaping not just military doctrine but the fundamental relationship between technology, democracy, and power in the modern world. The B-29 campaign had demonstrated something profound, that in the age of industrial warfare, the nation that could best harness its productive capacity, that could turn its factories from consumer goods to weapons of war with breathtaking speed, that could innovate and adapt and solve seemingly impossible engineering challenges, would dominate the battlefield regardless of its enemy's courage or tactical skill. Colonel Takeo Yoshida, who had commanded fighter squadrons defending Osaka during the firebombing raids of 1945, spent the last decades of his life teaching at Japan's National Defense Academy. In lectures to young officers who had grown up in the prosperous, peaceful Japan of the economic miracle, Yoshida would speak not of tactics or strategy, but of the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed Japan's war effort. "We prepared to fight the war we understood," he would say, his voice still carrying the authority of a combat veteran. "We trained our pilots to be the best in the world. We designed our fighters to be faster, more maneuverable, longer-ranged than anything our enemies possessed. We studied the art of war as our ancestors had studied it for centuries. And then the Americans arrived with an aircraft that made all of that preparation irrelevant." Yoshida would describe the frustration of watching B-29 formations cruise. Overhead at altitudes his fighters could barely reach, even when stripped of all unnecessary weight. He would recall the rage and helplessness of ordering intercept missions that he knew would fail, of watching young pilots push their aircraft to the breaking point in pursuit of bombers that remained serenely beyond reach. "It was not that American pilots were better than us," he would explain. "In many cases, they were less experienced, less skilled in traditional dogfighting, but they did not need to be better. They had an aircraft that operated in a realm we could not access. They had industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. They had a system, technological, industrial, organizational, that was simply superior to ours." This admission did not come easily to men raised in the Bushido tradition, trained to believe that spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese military culture had long emphasized the importance of willpower, of fighting spirit, seishin, as the decisive factor in combat. The warrior who refused to surrender, who fought to the death with unwavering determination, was celebrated as the ideal. This ideology had served Japan well in earlier conflicts against enemies who operated with similar technological capabilities. Against Chinese forces in Manchuria, against Russian troops in 1904, 1905, Japanese determination and tactical skill had compensated for industrial disadvantages. But the B-29 campaign revealed the limits of that ideology. No amount of fighting spirit could close a 5,000-foot altitude gap. No tactical brilliance could intercept bombers that flew beyond radar range and fighter ceiling. The Americans had not simply outfought Japan. They had outthought Japan, creating a weapon system that made traditional combat virtues strategically irrelevant. The technological gap was not merely a matter of one aircraft. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two societies approached problem-solving and innovation. American engineers designing the B-29 worked in an environment that encouraged experimentation, accepted failure as part of the development process, and rewarded innovative thinking. When the Wright R-3350 engines proved prone to overheating and fires during testing, Boeing engineers redesigned the cowling, improved the cooling system, and modified the fuel injection, a process that took months but ultimately produced a reliable power plant. When test pilot Eddie Allen died in a prototype crash, the program continued because institutional knowledge was distributed across hundreds of engineers rather than concentrated in a few individuals. When high-altitude bombing proved ineffective, General Curtis LeMay redesigned the entire tactical approach, stripping guns from the aircraft and switching to low-altitude incendiary attacks, a flexibility that would have been impossible in the rigid Japanese military hierarchy. Japanese military development, by contrast, operated within a system that valued consensus over innovation, that punished failure rather than learning from it. The concentrated decision-making authority in a small group of senior officers who often prioritized tradition over effectiveness. When Japanese engineers proposed radical new aircraft designs, they frequently encountered resistance from commanders who preferred incremental improvements to proven types. When early models showed defects, the tendency was to blame manufacturing quality or pilot technique rather than fundamental design flaws. The result was a military that excelled at refining existing concepts but struggled to make the kind of revolutionary leaps that characterized American weapons development. The B-29 itself embodied this American approach to innovation. It was not simply a bigger bomber or a higher-flying bomber. It was a complete reimagining of what a bomber could be. The pressurized cabin meant crews could operate at extreme altitudes without oxygen masks and heated suits, reducing fatigue and improving performance. The remote-controlled gun turrets, aimed by sophisticated fire control computers, allowed a single gunner to operate multiple turrets, reducing crew requirements and defensive vulnerabilities. The high-altitude capability meant the aircraft could attack targets previously considered invulnerable. Every system on the B-29 pushed the boundaries of existing technology, and while this created enormous development challenges, it resulted in an aircraft a generation ahead of anything else in service. Japanese attempts to counter the B-29 revealed the technological chasm that had opened between the two nations. Engineers developed the Nakajima Ki-87, a high-altitude interceptor specifically designed to reach B-29 cruising altitudes. It featured a turbocharged engine, pressurized cockpit, and heavy armament. The prototype first flew in April 1945, too late to affect the war's outcome. Only one was ever built. Even if it had entered production earlier, Japanese industrial capacity could not have manufactured such complex aircraft in meaningful numbers. The Ki-87 required advanced materials, precision manufacturing, and sophisticated systems that Japanese factories, already crippled by B-29 raids and starved of raw materials by American submarines, simply could not produce. This pattern repeated across every category of military technology. Japan developed radar, but could not miniaturize it effectively or produce it in quantity. Japan understood the importance of signals intelligence, but lacked the industrial capacity to build the computing machines necessary to process intercepted communications. Japan recognized the potential of guided missiles, but could not develop reliable guidance systems. In each case, Japanese scientists and engineers understood the theoretical principles. They were not intellectually inferior to their American counterparts, but they worked within an industrial and organizational system that could not translate theoretical knowledge into mass-produced weapons at the speed required by modern warfare. The firebombing campaign that began in March 1945 highlighted another American advantage: the willingness to pursue strategies that maximized efficiency even when they challenged traditional military ethics. The decision to target Japanese cities with incendiaries, knowing that the resulting firestorms would kill tens of thousands of civilians, was morally troubling even to the men who executed the orders. Captain Robert Morgan, who had flown the Memphis Belle through 25 missions over Germany, found the Tokyo firebombing raids psychologically devastating. Over Germany, we were hitting industrial targets, military installations, things that directly supported the enemy war effort, he later wrote. Over Japan, we were burning whole neighborhoods full of families. The strategic justification was that Japanese home industry, small workshops building parts for aircraft and weapons, was distributed throughout residential areas. But when you smelled burning flesh at 10,000 feet, that justification felt pretty thin. Yet LeMay and his planners understood that this brutal approach was achieving strategic objectives that precision high-altitude bombing had failed to accomplish. Japanese war production was collapsing. The destruction of urban housing was forcing millions of workers to flee the cities, further crippling industrial output. The psychological impact on civilian morale was eroding support for the military government. And critically, American losses remained minimal. Less than 1% of B-29s dispatched failed to return from these missions. LeMay, a man who famously said that if America lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal, pursued the most effective strategy available regardless of its moral cost. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the ruthless application of industrial warfare principles to achieve strategic objectives with minimum American casualties. Japanese military planners had no effective counter to this approach. They could not stop the raids. They could not adequately protect civilians. They could not maintain war production in the face of systematic urban destruction. The Ketsugo Plan, prepared for the defense of the home islands against invasion, called for total mobilization of the population, including civilian militia armed with bamboo spears and crude explosives. It was a plan born of desperation, a recognition that conventional military resistance was impossible. Japanese leaders spoke of accepting millions of casualties to make an American invasion so costly that the United States would negotiate a conditional surrender. But the B-29 campaign made invasion unnecessary. By July 1945, Japan was already defeated in every meaningful sense. Its cities were in ruins. Its navy had been destroyed. Its air force was reduced to kamikaze attacks, suicide missions that reflected both the courage and the hopelessness of Japan's position. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August simply provided a face-saving excuse for surrender, a catastrophe so novel and overwhelming that Japanese leaders could capitulate without admitting that conventional bombing had already broken their nation's capacity to resist.
January 17th, 1944. Anzio, Italy. 04:30 hours. The morning fog clung to the beaches like a shroud, thick and cold. Along the waterline, American soldiers of the 6th Corps crouched in shallow foxholes, their breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The only sounds were the distant rumble of the sea and the rhythmic clanking of metal against metal. Behind them, emerging from the gray mist like ancient gods of war, came the guns. Massive, deliberate, each one weighing over 15 tons, towed by tractors that groaned under the strain. The barrels stretched 23 feet into the air, so long they seemed to pierce the very sky itself. The crews moved with practiced efficiency, unhooking the trails, digging the spades into Italian soil still soft from winter rain. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Every man knew what was coming. Every man knew what these weapons could do. The 155 mm gun M, unknown to every GI who ever served beside it as the Long Tom, had arrived at Anzio. And with it came a new kind of terror for the German defenders dug into the hills beyond. One artilleryman, Private First Class Eugene Lawson of the 36th Field Artillery Battalion, would later write home to his mother in Kansas. We unloaded the Toms in the dark. You could feel the weight of them even before you touched the steel. It wasn't just metal. It was promise. It was payback. It was everything we'd been waiting to give them since Kasserine. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the Alban Hills, the Long Tom spoke. The sound was not a roar. It was a physical force, a concussion that hit you in the chest, in the teeth, in the bones. The earth itself seemed to recoil, and 23,000 yards away, over 13 miles, German bunkers built from reinforced concrete and steel began to disintegrate. This was not the war the Wehrmacht had trained for. This was not the war they expected. This was American industrial power given form and voice, and it was about to rewrite the rules of warfare on every front where it appeared. In the autumn of 1939, as German panzer divisions carved through Poland with surgical precision and Stuka dive bombers screamed from the skies, the world witnessed a new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg, lightning war. Speed, shock, and overwhelming force concentrated at a single point. The Polish army, brave but outmatched, crumbled in 35 days. The Wehrmacht had proven its doctrine: mobility, combined arms, and the will to strike first and strike hard. Artillery, in this new German philosophy, was tactical. It was mobile. It moved with the tanks, supported the infantry, and kept pace with the speed of modern mechanized war. The Germans employed the 105mm LEFH-18 howitzer, the 150mm SFH-18, effective weapons, proven designs. But they were built for a war of movement, not a war of annihilation from distance. The German High Command believed the next war would be won quickly. They believed in the power of maneuver. They believed that static warfare, the kind that had defined the trenches of the First World War, was a relic of the past, a mistake never to be repeated. Their artillery reflected this belief. It was good. It was adequate. But it was not designed to reach deep behind enemy lines, to strike at command posts and supply depots and reinforcement columns 20 miles away. That kind of range required a commitment of resources, of steel and engineering and industrial capacity that the Wehrmacht, in its arrogance, did not believe it needed. The German 170mm Kanone 18, their heaviest field gun, could reach 29,000 yards, impressive by any standard. But it was rare, cumbersome, required a special railway mounting or an elaborate road transport system, and took hours to emplace. By 1944, Germany had produced fewer than 300 of these weapons for the entire Wehrmacht. They were precious, reserved for critical sectors, and their crews knew that losing one meant it would likely never be replaced. Across the Atlantic, in the sprawling industrial heartland of America, a different philosophy was taking shape. The United States Army had watched the Great War unfold from a distance before finally entering in 1917, and its officers had learned painful lessons in the mud of the Meuse-Argonne. They had seen what modern artillery could do. They had seen the carnage, yes, but they had also seen the potential. They understood that wars were not won by speed alone. They were won by the ability to project power, to reach across vast distances, to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight before he ever reached the front line. In 1938, as Europe teetered on the brink of catastrophe, the United States Army Ordnance Department issued a requirement for a new gun. It needed to fire a 155mm shell, a projectile weighing nearly 100 pounds. It needed to reach targets at least 25,000 yards away, and it needed to be mobile enough to keep pace with a modern army. The task fell to the engineers at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, men who understood metallurgy and ballistics, men who had studied the failures of the First World War and were determined not to repeat them. The result was the 155mm gun M1, the Long Tom. It was not elegant. It was not pretty. The Germans had their legendary 80mm flak gun, sleek and versatile, celebrated in propaganda and feared on the battlefield. The Long Tom was a brute. Its barrel alone weighed over 8 tons. Fully assembled with its split trail and firing platform, the weapon system stretched over 36 feet from trail to muzzle. It required a crew of 14 men to operate at full efficiency. It could not be deployed quickly. It could not hide easily. But what it could do, no other field gun in the world could match. It could fire a 95-pound high-explosive shell to a distance of 25,700 yards, 14.5 miles, with precision, with devastating effect. And it could keep firing round after round for hours. The barrel was manufactured using a process called autofritage, where the steel was subjected to immense internal pressure during production, creating residual stresses that allowed it to withstand the tremendous forces generated when the gun fired. The breech mechanism was designed for speed and reliability. A well-trained crew could fire one round every 2 minutes indefinitely. The recoil system, a combination of hydraulic buffers and springs, absorbed the tremendous kickback, allowing the gun to remain stable and accurate even after hundreds of rounds. But the real genius of the Long Tom was not in its individual components. It was in the system that supported it. Every gun came with detailed firing tables, carefully calculated to account for temperature, humidity, altitude, and wind. Forward observers, trained in the art of calling fire, worked in concert with fire direction centers where officers used mechanical computers, analog devices that could calculate firing solutions faster than any human mathematician. The ammunition was standardized, quality controlled, produced in quantities that seemed impossible to the resource-starved Axis powers. By the end of the war, American factories had produced over 1,000 long toms, 1,000 weapons, each capable of firing thousands of rounds over its service life. The mathematics were staggering. The implications were clear. America could afford to fight a war of material. Germany could not. The first long toms reached North Africa in late 1942, arriving just as American forces were recovering from the humiliation of Kasserine Pass. There, in the rocky hills of Tunisia, the U.S. Army had met the Afrika Korps in open battle and had been savaged. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had outmaneuvered and outfought the green American troops, sending them reeling backward in confusion and panic. American commanders had made fundamental mistakes. Their tanks were dispersed. Their infantry was poorly coordinated. Their artillery, though numerous, was employed piecemeal, without the concentration of force needed to break German positions. It was a brutal introduction to modern warfare. American soldiers, many of whom had enlisted believing the war would be over quickly, found themselves facing an enemy who was professional, experienced, and utterly ruthless. The retreat from Kasserine was chaotic. Equipment was abandoned. Units became separated. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed that the American military might not be ready for this war. But the American commanders learned. They adapted. General George S. Patton took command of the II Corps and imposed discipline with an iron hand. Training intensified. Tactics were revised. And most importantly, the tools they would need to fight on equal terms began to arrive. The long toms came ashore at Algiers in February 1943, still painted in the olive drab of factory production, still smelling of cosmoline and machine oil. The crews were young, nervous, eager. Most had never fired the weapon outside of training ranges in the United States. They had practiced the manual of arms, learned the technical specifications, drilled endlessly on the procedures for emplacing and firing, but they had never heard the sound of German shells landing nearby. They had never felt the ground shake from enemy fire. They had never seen what their weapon could do to flesh and bone and concrete. That education came quickly. The German soldiers dug into the Tunisian hills had faced artillery before. The British 25-pounder, a superb weapon in its own right, had been pounding German positions for months. The American 100mm howitzer was proving effective in direct support roles. These were known quantities. You heard the whistle, you took cover, you waited for the barrage to pass, and then you came back up and resumed fighting. Artillery was dangerous, yes, but it was survivable. It was part of the calculus of war. But when the long toms opened fire for the first time, something changed. The shells came from distances the Germans didn't think possible. There was no warning. No aircraft overhead, no forward observers visible on the horizon. Just sudden, cataclysmic explosions in places the Wehrmacht had thought were safe. Command posts miles behind the front lines erupted in fire and shrapnel. Supply depots vanished in columns of black smoke. Artillery batteries, carefully positioned and camouflaged, were obliterated before they could fire a single round in reply. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich of the 21st Panzer Division wrote in his diary, later captured by British forces near Tunis, "We do not understand where the shells are coming from. The Americans are too far away. It is impossible. Our officers say it is naval gunfire, but there are no ships. There is no logic to it. We are being killed by ghosts. The men are beginning to fear that the Americans have some new secret weapon, something we cannot fight. Morale is collapsing." But they were not ghosts. They were mathematicians. They were surveyors. They were gunnery sergeants who had trained for months in the deserts of California and Arizona, calculating angles and trajectories, adjusting for wind and temperature and the curvature of the Earth itself. The Long Tom crews didn't just fire shells. They delivered precision destruction over distances that defied the German understanding of field artillery. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German soldiers began to realize that nowhere was safe. Not the rear areas, not the supply lines, not the places where they had always been able to rest, to eat, to sleep without fear. The Americans could reach them anywhere, and they did, relentlessly, without mercy, without pause. In early May 1943, as the Axis forces in North Africa made their final stand near Tunis, the Long Toms were everywhere. They fired from positions in the valleys, from hilltops, from olive groves and dry riverbeds. They fired at German strongpoints and troop concentrations. They fired at the ports where Axis forces were desperately trying to evacuate. They fired at the airfields where the Luftwaffe was mounting its last futile sorties. The German and Italian soldiers trapped in the Tunisian pocket had run out of options. There was no retreat. The sea was behind them, and the Allied navies controlled it absolutely. There was no reinforcement. The air and sea routes from Sicily and Italy were under constant attack. There was no hope. And into this cauldron of despair, the Long Toms poured their fire day after day, until the Axis forces had no choice but to surrender. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa laid down their arms. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers went into captivity. It was a disaster on the scale of Stalingrad, and it had the same effect on Axis morale. The invincible Wehrmacht had been defeated, not through some clever maneuver or strategic genius, but through the simple application of overwhelming force. The Americans had brought more guns, more shells, more everything, and they had used them without hesitation. Among the captured documents and equipment, Allied intelligence officers found German after-action reports that made repeated references to the American heavy guns and their impossible range. One report, filed by a German artillery officer shortly before the surrender, stated simply, "We cannot compete with American firepower. We do not have the guns. We do not have the ammunition. We do not have the industrial capacity. Recommend immediate development of counter-battery, capabilities or acceptance that future operations against American forces will result in unsustainable casualties." The recommendation was noted, filed, and ultimately ignored, because the Wehrmacht had bigger problems. The Eastern Front was consuming men and material at a rate that dwarfed anything happening in the Mediterranean. And besides, how bad could American artillery really be? At Salerno in September 1943, they found out the Allied invasion of mainland Italy had been sold to the public as the beginning of the end. The newspapers called it the soft underbelly of Europe, a phrase that suggested easy victory and rapid advance. The reality was far different. The Germans had no intention of giving up Italy without a fight. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the Wehrmacht's most capable commanders, had prepared a defense in depth, and when the Allies came ashore at Salerno on September 9th, they walked into a trap. The German counterattack was ferocious. Panzer divisions that the Allies had not known were in the area suddenly appeared, driving toward the beaches with the kind of coordinated fury that had characterized the Blitzkrieg years earlier. For 3 desperate days, the Allied beachhead teetered on the edge of disaster. German tanks reached positions where they could fire directly on the landing craft. Infantry units were pushed back to within sight of the sea. Evacuation plans were drawn up. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, later admitted that he had contemplated withdrawing the entire force. And then the guns arrived. The Long Toms came ashore under fire, brought in by landing craft that had to dodge German artillery and mortar rounds. The crews worked like demons, manhandling the massive pieces into position, digging them in, setting up the ammunition dumps, establishing communications with forward observers and fire direction centers. They worked through the night, through German shelling, through the chaos and confusion that characterized the beachhead. And at dawn on September 12th, they opened fire. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. Their assembly areas, where panzer companies were gathering for the final push to the sea, erupted in flame. The roads leading to the front, clogged with reinforcements and supply vehicles, became killing zones. German artillery batteries positioned to support the attack were located and destroyed before they could fire their preparatory barrages. The Long Toms fired continuously. Crews worked in shifts, but the guns never stopped. The barrels became so hot that they glowed in the darkness. Water poured on them for cooling evaporated instantly with a hiss of steam. The ground around each gun position was littered with spent shell casings, brass cylinders the size of fire extinguishers, hundreds of them, thousands of them, a golden carpet of American firepower. The German advance stalled. Units that had been ordered to attack found their start lines under bombardment. Communications broke down as command posts were hit. Supply lines were severed. The carefully coordinated assault dissolved into isolated actions by individual companies and platoons, each one fighting alone, each one being systematically destroyed by American artillery and infantry working in concert. By September 14th, the crisis was over. The German counteroffensive had failed. Kesselring ordered a withdrawal to prepared positions farther north. The Salerno beachhead was secure, and in the German after-action reports, there was a new tone of something approaching despair. General Lieutenant Fritz von Schack, commanding the 16th Panzer Division at Salerno, later testified during Allied interrogations. "We had expected artillery. We had prepared for it. We had positioned our forces to minimize vulnerability to observed fire. But the range and accuracy of the American heavy guns was beyond anything we had planned for. We could not mass our forces. We could not bring forward reinforcements without suffering catastrophic losses. Every approach route was covered. Every assembly area was targeted. It was not a battle. It was an execution. My division lost over 60% of its fighting strength in 3 days, and we never engaged the main American defensive positions. We were destroyed by artillery fire alone." The Americans had discovered something that would define the rest of the war in Europe, that properly employed artillery, particularly long-range artillery like the Long Tom, could break up German attacks before they ever reached friendly lines. It was defensive warfare taken to its logical extreme. The enemy could not hurt you if he could not reach you, and if your guns could reach him first, from distances he could not match. Then the outcome was never in doubt. As the Italian campaign ground northward through the autumn and winter of 1943, the Long Toms became the backbone of American firepower. The terrain of Italy favored the defender at every turn. Mountain ranges ran across the peninsula like the ribs of some ancient beast, each one a natural barrier, each one fortified by German engineers who had months to prepare. The rivers, swollen by fall rains, became obstacles that channeled Allied advances into predictable killing zones. And the weather, cold, wet, miserable, turned the whole country into a sea of mud. It was the worst possible terrain for armored warfare. Tanks bogged down, vehicles slid off mountain roads, supply lines stretched thin. The infantry, slogging forward through the mud and rain, faced an enemy who was dug into positions that seemed carved from the mountains themselves, but the Long Toms could reach them. At the Winter Line, the first of the German defensive positions south of Rome, the guns proved their worth again and again. German strongpoints, built into mountainsides and reinforced with concrete, were methodically reduced. The process was slow, grinding, unglamorous. Forward observers, often from elite units like the Rangers or airborne divisions, would infiltrate close to German positions, sometimes within a few hundred yards, and call in fire. The corrections would be radioed back to the fire direction centers, the calculations made, the guns adjusted. And then the shells would arrive one after another, smashing into stone and steel until the position was no longer tenable. The Germans adapted. They learned to disperse their positions, to build deeper bunkers, to move constantly to avoid being targeted. But adaptation required resources, and resources were something the Wehrmacht had less of every day. Every shell fired by a Long Tom represented a ton of explosives that had been manufactured in America, shipped across the Atlantic, transported through the Italian countryside, and delivered precisely where it was needed. The Germans could build bunkers, but they could not build them faster than American shells could destroy them. Private Eugene Lawson, now a corporal, wrote in December 1943, "We have been firing for 6 straight days. The ammunition trucks come up every night, 20 tons of shells, and by morning they are gone. We fire them all. The lieutenant says we are supporting an attack on some hill I have never heard of. We cannot see it. We cannot see anything but mud and more guns. But we fire, and the infantry tells us we are saving their lives, so we keep firing. My hands are raw from handling the shells. The powder burns have scarred my forearms. I smell like cordite and gun oil. I cannot remember what silence sounds like. This was the reality of the Long Tom crews. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not charge enemy positions or fly daring missions. They operated machines. They hauled shells. They calculated angles. And they fired, day after day, night after night, in conditions that would have broken lesser men, but they were proud of their work, because they knew with absolute certainty that their weapon was making a difference. Every shell fired was one less German soldier shooting at American infantry. Every bunker destroyed was one less obstacle on the road to Rome. Every German gun silenced meant one less threat to the men on the front line. By the time the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Long Tom had become a legend in both armies. American soldiers knew that if they could hold out, if they could survive the initial German counterattacks, the Long Toms would arrive and the tide would turn. German soldiers knew that the arrival of the American heavy guns meant the battle was effectively over. It was only a matter of time before their positions were reduced to rubble and they were forced to retreat or surrender. The Normandy landings were the largest amphibious operation in history, and the planning had taken years. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, and central to those plans was artillery. The Allies knew that the German defenses along the Atlantic Wall were formidable, that the Wehrmacht would fight with desperate courage to throw the invaders back into the sea. They knew that the battle would be won or lost in the first few days, before the Germans could bring up their reserves and launch a coordinated counteroffensive. The Long Toms were part of the first wave. They came ashore at Utah and Omaha beaches, dragged through the surf by amphibious tractors and sheer human determination. Men drowned trying to get them ashore. Equipment was lost. Some guns were hit by German artillery fire while still on the landing craft. But enough made it. Enough were emplaced, their trails dug into the sand, their barrels elevated toward the hedgerows and fields beyond. And within hours of the landing, they were firing. The German defenders in Normandy had expected a tough fight. They had expected Allied air superiority and naval gunfire, but they had not expected the speed with which American artillery came ashore and began operating. German commanders, monitoring the battle from their headquarters inland, received reports that seemed impossible. American guns were already firing from the beaches, hitting targets miles inland. How could this be? The landings had only just begun. Where was the confusion, the chaos, the vulnerable period when the attackers were disorganized and could be destroyed? It never came. The Americans came ashore with a plan, and they executed it with mechanical precision. And the Long Toms were the guarantors of that plan. They provided the firepower umbrella that allowed the infantry and tanks to push inland, that destroyed German counterattacks before they could develop, that made the beachheads secure. Across the hedgerows of Normandy and the rolling fields and sunken roads, the Battle of France became a grinding, brutal affair. The terrain favored the defender at every turn. Every hedge was a potential ambush. Every stone farmhouse a fortress. The German army, though battered and depleted by years of war on multiple fronts, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending their homeland. And they were good, battle-hardened, experienced, disciplined. The Wehrmacht was still a formidable force, but they could not withstand the Long Toms. American artillery doctrine in World War II was built on a principle the Germans never fully grasped: time on target. Multiple batteries, sometimes entire battalions, firing from different positions, coordinated so that every shell, dozens, sometimes hundreds, arrived at the target at the exact same instant. There was no warning. No preliminary barrage to signal the attack, just sudden, overwhelming annihilation. One moment, a German position was intact, the soldiers eating or cleaning weapons or writing letters home. The next moment, it ceased to exist, and the Long Toms, with their extraordinary range, could participate in these fire missions from positions the Germans could never hope to reach with counter-battery fire. The mathematics were simple and brutal. American guns could hit German positions. German guns could not hit back. Therefore, the Americans would win. The Germans tried everything to counter the Long Toms. They brought forward their heaviest artillery, the 170mm guns and 210mm howitzers that were supposed to match American range. But there were so few of them, and they were so difficult to move and supply, that they made little difference. German counter-battery fire was sporadic and ineffective. The Americans, with their superior fire direction techniques and abundant ammunition, could afford to expend dozens of shells locating and destroying a single German gun. The Germans could not afford such profligacy. Every shell fired was a shell they might need desperately tomorrow. The disparity in ammunition supply became one of the defining factors of the Normandy campaign. An American artillery battalion could fire thousands of shells in a single day and know that more would arrive that night. A German battalion had to ration every round, hoarding ammunition against the attack that might come tomorrow or the day after. German artillery officers, trained to believe in the decisive power of massed fire, found themselves unable to mass anything. They could not afford to. At the Battle of Mortain in August 1944, the Long Toms saved the Normandy breakout. The American offensive, Operation Cobra, had shattered the German front and sent Patton's Third Army racing across France. But Hitler, in one of his increasingly irrational strategic decisions, ordered a counter-offensive. Operation Lüttich was designed to cut through the American lines, reach the coast at Avranches, and split the Allied armies in two. If it succeeded, the entire Normandy campaign would be in jeopardy. The attack began on the night of August 6th. German panzer divisions, scraped together from across the front, smashed into American defensive positions around the town of Mortain. The fighting was savage. German tanks, many of them the formidable Panthers and Tigers, punched through the initial defensive lines. American infantry, outnumbered and outgunned, fell back fighting. For 48 hours, the outcome hung in the balance. The weather was overcast. Allied air power, the decisive factor in so many battles, was grounded by low clouds and rain. The fighter bombers that usually decimated German armored columns could not fly. It came down to the infantry, the tanks, and the guns. The Long Toms fired without pause. Every available gun in the First Army was brought to bear on the German offensive. Fire direction centers coordinated fire missions that involved dozens of batteries firing simultaneously. The shells fell in a continuous rain of steel and high explosive. German columns, trying to push forward along narrow roads through the Norman countryside, were caught in the open and annihilated. The gunners worked until their hands bled, loading and firing and loading again. The recoil mechanisms, designed for sustained fire, were pushed beyond their limits. Some guns had to be taken out of action temporarily as worn parts were replaced, but the fire never stopped. When one gun went silent for maintenance, two others increased their rate of fire to compensate. The barrels became so hot that they glowed cherry red in the darkness. Water poured on them for cooling evaporated instantly into clouds of steam that hung over the gun positions like fog. The ground around each gun was churned to soup by the recoil, the heavy trails digging deeper trenches with every shot. Shell casings piled up until they had to be bulldozed aside to make room for more. Private Eugene Lawson, now a sergeant and gun commander, kept a tally on the breech of his gun. Each mark represented 10 rounds fired. By the end of the first day, there were 27 marks. By the end of the second day, there were 53. Over 500 rounds from a single gun. Multiply that by the dozens of Long Toms in action, and the scale of firepower becomes almost incomprehensible. The German offensive broke. Units that had been ordered to push through to Avranches found their routes blocked by burning vehicles and cratered roads. Communications broke down as command posts were hit repeatedly. Supply columns, desperately trying to bring forward fuel and ammunition, were destroyed before they could reach the front. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Infantry units, separated from their armor support, were surrounded and captured. By August 8th, it was over. The German counteroffensive had been shattered. The road to Falaise was open. The Wehrmacht's last chance to stabilize the front in France was gone. And among the wreckage, scattered across the Norman countryside, were the remains of hundreds of German vehicles and guns that had never even seen the enemy that destroyed them. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, commanding a battle group in the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote in his memoirs. We had thought we understood American artillery. We had faced it in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. We had learned to respect it. But at Mortain, we learned something else. We learned that the Americans could bring to bear a weight of fire that was simply beyond our experience. It was not a barrage. It was not a bombardment. It was industrial-scale destruction, applied with precision and sustained without limit. The Long Tom was not just a weapon. It was a statement of industrial might. It told us, in language we could not ignore, that we were facing an enemy who could produce such guns by the hundreds, who could supply them with unlimited ammunition, and who had the will to use them without mercy. At Mortain, I began to understand that we had already lost the war. The symbolism of the Long Tom extended far beyond its physical destruction. For German soldiers raised on the mythology of Prussian military excellence and the supposed superiority of German engineering, the gun represented something they had been taught was impossible: that an industrial democracy, a nation of shopkeepers and farmers and factory workers, could produce a weapon superior to anything the fatherland could create. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years telling the German people that democracies were weak, that they lacked the discipline and unity of purpose necessary to wage modern war. Americans, in particular, were portrayed as soft, decadent, more interested in jazz music and Hollywood movies than in serious military matters. The German soldier was told that he was fighting for a cause that transcended mere politics, that the National Socialist Revolution had created a new kind of warrior, harder and more determined than anything the democratic nations could produce. The Long Tom shattered these illusions. It was proof that American abundance was not a weakness, but a strength. Every shell fired represented a supply chain that stretched back across the Atlantic Ocean to the factories of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan. It represented the miners who dug the ore from the earth, working in shifts around the clock. It represented the steel workers who forged the barrels in foundries so hot that men could only work in short intervals. It represented the chemists who formulated the propellants and explosives, the precision that ensured each shell would perform exactly as designed. It represented the railroad workers who transported the components across a continent, the longshoremen who loaded the crates onto ships, the convoy sailors who braved the U-boats and the storms of the North Atlantic, the port battalions who unloaded the cargo in Britain and France, and the truck drivers who delivered the ammunition to the batteries, no matter the weather, no matter the danger. And behind all of this was an economy that could produce such weapons while simultaneously building aircraft carriers and bombers and tanks and small arms, while feeding and clothing millions of soldiers, while maintaining the highest standard of living in the world for its civilian population. The Long Tom was not just a gun. It was proof of American industrial supremacy. The Germans had no answer to this. They could produce excellent weapons. The Tiger II tank was probably the most powerful armored vehicle of the war. The MG-42 machine gun was unmatched in its rate of fire and reliability. The Type declassified U-boat was a revolutionary design that might have changed the Battle of the Atlantic if it had been introduced earlier. German engineering was superb, but German industry could not produce these weapons in the quantities needed. By 1944, German factories were struggling under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. Raw materials were in short supply. The transportation network was breaking down under constant air attack. Skilled labor was being drafted into the Wehrmacht to replace casualties on the Eastern Front. Production quotas were not being met. New weapons that might have made a difference remained in prototype or small batch production. Meanwhile, American factories were hitting their stride. Production lines that had been retooled from automobiles to tanks were operating with ruthless efficiency. Workers who had never built a weapon before the war were now skilled machinists and welders and assemblers. Quality control was rigorous, and the output was staggering. In 1944 alone, American industry produced over 1,000 artillery pieces of 155mm caliber or larger. The Germans, in the same period, produced fewer than 500 heavy guns of all types. The disparity in ammunition production was even more dramatic. American factories turned out hundreds of millions of shells. German production was measured in tens of millions, and much of that was consumed on the Eastern Front. The Long Tom became a symbol of this disparity. German soldiers, huddled in their bunkers and trenches, came to dread the sound of its distinctive report. They could identify it by ear, distinguish it from other American guns, and they knew that when they heard it, death was coming from a distance they could not fight back against. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces closed in on the German border, the Long Toms played a critical role in one of the war's most forgotten yet strategically vital campaigns, the reduction of the fortress cities along the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall as the Germans called it, was a defensive system that stretched from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. It had been built in the 1930s as a response to the French Maginot Line, and it consisted of thousands of bunkers, tank traps, minefields, and fortified positions. Some of the bunkers were massive concrete structures with walls 10 feet thick, designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest artillery. The Germans had spent years building this line, and they believed it was impregnable. The Long Toms proved them wrong. At Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies, the guns opened the way. Aachen was not just a city. It was a symbol. Charlemagne had been crowned there over 1,000 years earlier. It was the historical heart of the First Reich, and Hitler had ordered it held at all costs. The German defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht regulars and Volkssturm militia, were determined to make the Americans pay in blood for every street. The Americans had other plans. For days before the infantry assault, the Long Toms pounded the outer defenses. Forward observers, working from positions in the surrounding hills, called in fire on specific bunkers and strong points. The process was methodical, almost clinical. Each bunker was targeted individually. The first rounds were ranging shots, adjusted until they were landing within meters of the target. Then the full fire mission would commence. Dozens of shells, sometimes hundreds, all concentrated on a single fortification. The German defenders, trapped inside their concrete tombs, could do nothing but endure. The noise was beyond description. Each impact sent shockwaves through the structure. Dust and concrete fragments filled the air. The lights went out. Communications were severed. Men huddled in the darkness, praying that the next shell would not be the one that penetrated, that their bunker would hold, that the bombardment would eventually stop. But it didn't stop. The Long Toms fired for hours, sometimes for days, at individual positions, and eventually the concrete cracked. The steel reinforcements bent. The walls collapsed. And when the American infantry finally advanced, they found bunkers that had simply ceased to exist. Walls were breached. Roofs had caved in. Steel doors designed to withstand any attack were blown off their hinges. Inside, the defenders were either dead or too stunned to resist. A captured German officer, Hauptmann Otto Schneider of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, told his interrogators, "We had been promised that the fortifications would hold. We had been told that the West Wall was impregnable, that the American guns could not touch us. We believed this. We had seen the bunkers, touched the concrete, measured the thickness of the walls, but the shells came through as if it were paper. The bombardment lasted 3 days. 3 days without rest, without relief, without hope. My men were not killed in battle. They were not defeated by superior tactics. They were buried alive by American artillery. There was nothing we could do. We could not fight what we could not see. We could not reach what we could not touch. When the Americans finally came, we surrendered immediately. Better captivity than another hour under those guns." The reduction of Aachen took 3 weeks. When it was over, the city was a ruin, but it was in American hands. And the message was clear to every German soldier on the West Wall: the fortifications would not save you. The concrete would not protect you. The Long Toms would find you, and they would destroy you. As the winter of 1944 descended on Europe, bringing with it freezing temperatures and heavy snow, the war entered its final, most desperate phase. In December, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a gamble born of desperation, conceived by Hitler himself over the objections of his generals. The plan was audacious: punch through the American lines in the Ardennes. Where they were weakest, drive northwest to the Meuse River and beyond to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and cutting off their main supply port. If it succeeded, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets in the East. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed it might succeed. The German offensive began in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944. Over 200,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, emerged from the forests of the Ardennes and smashed into American positions held primarily by Green, divisions that had never seen combat or exhausted, divisions that had been sent to a quiet sector to rest and refit. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. Communications broke down. Units were overrun or surrounded. In some sectors, there was panic. Entire battalions retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Roads became clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. German forces advanced 50 miles in the first week, creating a bulge in the American lines that gave the battle its name. For the German soldiers, many of whom had been retreating for months, it was an intoxicating moment. They were advancing again. They were winning. Perhaps the old magic, the blitzkrieg spirit that had carried them across Europe in 1940, had returned. But the Germans had made fatal miscalculations. They had assumed that the Americans, like the French in 1940, would collapse under the weight of surprise and shock. They had assumed that bad weather would keep Allied aircraft grounded long enough for German armor to reach its objectives. And they had assumed that they could resupply their forces through the captured American supply dumps they expected to overrun. They were wrong on all counts. The Americans did not collapse. Individual units, surrounded and outnumbered, fought with a determination that shocked the Germans. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units held the vital road junction against overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender despite being completely encircled. At St. Vith, American forces held for 6 days, buying crucial time for reinforcements to arrive. And across the entire front, American commanders reacted with a speed and flexibility that the Germans had not anticipated. Within 48 hours, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had completely reorganized his forces. Units were pulled from quiet sectors and rushed to the bulge. Patton's Third Army, fighting its way toward the German border far to the south, disengaged, wheeled 90 degrees north, and began a forced march through a blizzard to relieve Bastogne. And the artillery, including every available long tom, was rushed forward to contain the German penetration. The long toms arrived in the Ardennes forest in a state of organized chaos. Gun crews drove through snowstorms, their vehicles slipping on icy roads, sometimes coming under fire from German units that had already penetrated deep into the American rear areas. But they came, and they emplaced their guns in frozen fields and snow-covered forests, digging positions in ground so hard they had to use explosives to break through the frost layer, and they began to fire. The German offensive, which had relied on speed and momentum, began to slow. Supply columns, struggling to move forward on narrow forest roads, came under bombardment. The roads themselves, cratered by artillery fire, became impassable. German tanks, already short on fuel because the expected American supply dumps had not been captured, began running out of gas and had to be abandoned. Infantry units, pushing forward through the snow, found themselves cut off from support and surrounded. The long tom crews worked in conditions that would have broken most men. The temperature was below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow fell continuously. The guns had to be cleared of ice before every shot. The recoil mechanisms, designed for operation in moderate climates, threatened to seize up in the cold and had to be manually operated. Ammunition, delivered by truck to positions often miles from supply dumps, had to be manhandled through the snow. But they fired, without complaint, without pause, because they knew that American soldiers were depending on them, that men were fighting and dying in the snow-covered forests, and that the long toms were the only weapons that could reach deep behind German lines and destroy the supply columns and reserve formations that were sustaining the offensive. At Bastogne, the surrounded defenders held on in part because the long toms, firing from positions miles outside the German encirclement, were able to target enemy artillery and troop concentrations trying to overrun the town. The coordination required was extraordinary. Forward air controllers, flying in light aircraft through terrible weather, spotted German positions and radioed their locations to fire direction centers. The centers calculated firing solutions and transmitted them to the gun batteries. And the shells, fired from guns positioned 10 or 12 miles away, landed with devastating accuracy on targets that the gunners themselves never saw. Private Eugene Lawson, now a staff sergeant commanding his own gun crew, wrote in his journal on Christmas Day, 1944, "We fired 287 rounds today. I stopped counting after dark, but the lieutenant says the total for the battery was over 2,000 rounds. We are firing at German positions around a town called Bastogne. I have never heard of it. I cannot see it. But they tell us American paratroopers are surrounded there, and they are counting on us to keep the Germans off them until Patton's tanks can break through. So we fire. My hands are numb. I cannot feel my feet. The gun is coated in ice, and we have to chip it off after every few rounds. But we fire, because if this gun doesn't stop them, nothing will." By January, the German offensive was over. The bulge had been reduced. The Wehrmacht, shattered and exhausted, had lost the last of its strategic reserves. Over 100,000 German casualties. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. And the path into Germany was open. The Battle of the Bulge had been the Wehrmacht's last throw of the dice, and it had failed. Not because of some brilliant Allied strategy or tactical genius, but because the Americans had refused to break, had rallied and counterattacked with overwhelming force, and had brought to bear an artillery firepower that the Germans simply could not match. In the snow-covered fields of Belgium, the Long Toms had fired over 500,000 rounds during the 6 weeks of the battle. 500,000 shells, each one delivered with precision, each one taking a toll on German fighting strength. It was industrial warfare at its most elemental. Raw production capacity translated into battlefield dominance. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and drove deep into the heart of Germany, the nature of the war changed. The Wehrmacht was no longer an army in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of fragments. Desperate men fighting without hope, clinging to orders that no longer made sense. But still they fought. And still the Long Toms spoke. At Remagen, where American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7, 1945, the Germans threw everything they had at the crossing in a desperate attempt to destroy it. V-2 rockets, the world's first ballistic missiles, were redirected from targets in England to hit the bridge. Luftwaffe bombers, flying what amounted to suicide missions through overwhelming Allied air superiority, tried to destroy the span with bombs. Artillery was brought up and fired at maximum range. German frogmen, carrying demolition charges, swam down the river under cover of darkness. All of it failed. The Long Toms formed a protective ring around the Remagen bridgehead, firing constantly at German assembly areas, artillery positions, and approach routes. For 10 days, they did not stop. The crews rotated in shifts, 8 hours on, 4 hours off, but the guns never went silent. Forward observers, positioned in the hills overlooking the Rhine, called in fire missions continuously. German attempts to concentrate forces for a counterattack were broken up before they could even begin. One German artillery officer, Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, captured near Remagen in late March, later told Allied intelligence officers, "We knew where the bridge was. We knew where the Americans were establishing their bridgehead. We had maps, we had coordinates, we had direct observation. But we could not reach them. Our guns did not have the range. We tried to move closer, but every time we emplaced a battery, the American Long Toms found us within an hour and destroyed us. We lost 3 batteries in 2 days without firing a single effective round at the bridge. It was not war. It was slaughter. We were being killed by an enemy we could not touch, could not even see. The Americans sat on the far side of the river, behind a wall of artillery fire, and there was nothing we could do to reach them." The Remagen bridgehead was the beginning of the end. Once the Allies were across the Rhine in strength, the last natural barrier protecting Germany was gone. The Wehrmacht had no coherent front line, no strategic reserves, no hope of stopping the Allied advance. It became a race between the Western Allies and the Soviets to see who would reach Berlin first. The Long Toms continued to fire as the Allies drove deeper into Germany. They supported river crossings, reduced pockets of resistance, and destroyed the last scattered elements of German military power. But by April 1945, the targets were becoming fewer and more dispersed. The Wehrmacht was dissolving. Units were surrendering en masse, and the need for the kind of sustained, heavy bombardment that the Long Toms provided was diminishing. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Long Tom crews, exhausted beyond measure, fell silent. The guns that had spoken continuously for nearly 3 years were finally still. The battlefields fell quiet. And the men who had served those guns, who had fired millions of rounds across 3 continents, tried to comprehend that they had survived, that the war was over, that they could go home. In the Pacific Theater, the Long Tom wrote a different but equally devastating chapter. The war against Japan was fundamentally different from the war in Europe. It was a war of islands, of jungles and coral reefs, of amphibious assaults against fanatically defended positions. The Japanese strategy was simple and brutal. Make every island so costly to capture that the Americans would eventually negotiate a peace, rather, than pay the price of invasion. The Long Toms came ashore, with the Marines and Army infantry, at every major island assault from 1944 onward, and they rewrote that calculation. At Leyte in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the Long Toms provided the heavy firepower needed to crack open Japanese defenses that had been designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a battleship. The Japanese had learned from their earlier defeats. They no longer tried to defend the beaches. Instead, they dug into the interior of each island, creating defensive positions in caves and tunnels, building bunkers from coral and reinforced concrete, positioning artillery in hidden emplacements that could not be seen from the sea. The Long Toms were brought ashore in the early waves, often under fire and set up on beaches still contested by the enemy. The priority given to these guns was extraordinary. Ammunition ships were unloaded before supply vessels. Gun crews were given priority on landing craft, because the commanders knew that without the Long Toms, the battles for these islands would be far bloodier and far longer. On Okinawa, the last and largest of the island battles, the Long Toms were deployed in batteries that ringed the southern end of the island, targeting the Shuri Line, a defensive position so formidable that Allied planners had estimated it could take months to reduce. The Japanese had spent years fortifying Okinawa. They had dug into the limestone ridges that dominated the landscape, creating a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that connected defensive positions and allowed troops to move unseen. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies in underground depots. They had positioned artillery in caves with steel doors that could be closed between shots, making them nearly impossible to locate from the air. It was, in the words of one Marine Corps general, a fortress that would have made the Germans proud. The Long Toms fired for weeks. The bombardment was continuous, systematic, methodical. Forward observers, often from Marine reconnaissance units, infiltrated close to Japanese positions and called in fire. The corrections were radioed back to fire direction centers, where officers calculated firing solutions using the same techniques that had been perfected in North Africa and Europe. And the shells arrived, one after another, day and night, crashing into the limestone ridges with a violence that shook the entire island. The Japanese defenders, trapped in their underground positions, endured an ordeal that few human beings could survive with their sanity intact. The noise was constant. The explosions collapsed tunnels and sealed cave entrances. Dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. Communications broke down. Supply lines were cut. Men went mad from the stress and the isolation. A Japanese officer, Captain Tadashi Kojo, captured after the fall of Shuri Castle in late May 1945, later wrote in his account of the battle, "The American guns fired without stopping. We could not sleep. We could not eat. We could not move during the day. The shells found us even in the deepest tunnels. We had been told that the American soldier was weak, that he lacked the spirit of the samurai, that his reliance on machines made him soft. But the American guns had no spirit. They had only accuracy and endless ammunition. Against such a thing, courage means nothing. Bushido means nothing. We died in darkness, buried alive by explosions we could not escape, killed by an enemy we never saw. The reduction of the Shuri line took 6 weeks. When it finally fell, the Japanese defense of Okinawa collapsed. The battle continued for several more weeks as American forces cleared out the remaining pockets of resistance. But the outcome was no longer in doubt, and the Long Toms had been central to that victory. The Long Tom's legacy extends far beyond the battles it fought. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought in the modern age. Before the Long Tom, artillery was a supporting arm, useful but limited in its scope and effect. After the Long Tom, artillery became a decisive weapon, capable of shaping the battlefield and determining outcomes independent of infantry or armor. The gun itself continued in service long after World War II ended. It saw action in Korea, where it once again proved its worth against entrenched positions and mass infantry assaults. The Korean War, with its shifting front lines and mountain warfare, was ideal terrain for the Long Tom. The guns were emplaced on hilltops and ridges, from which they could reach deep into North Korean and Chinese rear areas. The Communists, who had plentiful infantry but limited heavy artillery, had no effective counter. The Long Tom was used by Allied nations across the globe throughout the Cold War. It was gradually replaced by more modern systems, self-propelled, guns with longer range and greater mobility, but the principles it established remained. Long-range, heavy projectile, precision fire. These became the foundation for every heavy artillery system that followed. But more than its technical legacy, the Long Tom left a psychological mark on those who faced it. For German and Japanese soldiers, the gun became synonymous with American power. It was proof that the United States could not only match the Axis powers in battle, but surpass them in the ways that ultimately mattered: industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and the will to apply overwhelming force without hesitation or mercy. For American soldiers, the Long Tom was something else entirely. It was a guardian, a protector, the big gun that reached out across impossible distances and destroyed the enemy before he could reach you. It was the sound that meant help was on the way, that someone was watching your back, that you were not alone in the vastness of the battlefield. Eugene Lawson, who served with the Long Toms from North Africa to the German border, who fired his gun on 3 continents and in countless battles, wrote in his final letter home before the war ended, "I have fired this gun in 3 countries and 2 continents. I have seen what it can do to bunkers and tanks and men. I have seen positions that were supposed to be impregnable reduced to rubble. I have seen enemy soldiers, brave men fighting for their countries, killed by shells fired from distances they didn't think possible. But what I will remember most, what I will carry with me for the rest of my life, is the faces of the infantry when they hear us fire. They smile. They relax. Their shoulders come down from around their ears, because they know that as long as the Long Toms are speaking, they have a chance. They know that someone is fighting for them, protecting them, giving them the firepower they need to survive. That is what this gun means to me. Not the destruction, not the killing, but the lives saved. The American boys who made it home because our gun destroyed the enemy position before they had to assault it. That is the legacy of the Long Tom. The 155mm gun M1, the Long Tom, was not the most glamorous weapon of World War II. It did not have the sleek menace of the P-51 Mustang or the brutal elegance of the M4 Sherman. It was not celebrated in propaganda posters or Hollywood movies. It did not receive a nickname that echoed through history like the B-29 Flying Fortress. It was a tool, a machine, a piece of equipment that did one thing, and did it supremely well. But in doing that one thing, it changed the course of the war. It gave American commanders a capability that no other army possessed, the ability to reach deep behind enemy lines and destroy targets with precision and sustained firepower. It allowed the United States to project power across distances that defied the understanding of its enemies. And it proved, beyond any doubt, that American industry, American ingenuity, and American resolve could produce weapons that were not just equal to those of the Axis, but superior in every meaningful way. The men who served the Long Toms were not glory seekers. They were artillerymen, often overlooked, rarely celebrated in the histories and memoirs that focused on infantry and armor and air power. Their contributions were measured not in dramatic charges or dogfights, but in tons of steel thrown at an enemy they rarely saw. They worked in mud and snow and scorching heat. They hauled shells that weighed nearly 100 pounds, over and over, thousands of times, until their backs ached and their hands bled and their hearing was permanently damaged by the concussion of the guns. They calculated angles and elevations, and windage with slide rules and mechanical, computers and paper firing tables, long before digital technology made such things easy. They worked in teams of 14 men, each one performing a specific task, each one essential to the operation of the weapon. The driver who positioned the tractor, the men who unhitched the gun and manhandled it into position, the crew chief who supervised the emplacement, the gunner who set the elevation and deflection, the loader who rammed the shells home, the assistant gunner who set the fuses, the ammunition handlers who brought forward the shells and powder charges, the fire direction officer who calculated the missions, the radio operator who maintained communications with forward observers and higher headquarters. Each one was vital. Each one contributed to the devastating effectiveness of the weapon system. And each one understood that their work, unglamorous and exhausting as it was saving American lives. They were the unseen hand of American victory, the force that reached across the battlefield and broke the enemy's will, the proof that democracy, for all its supposed weakness and inefficiency, could wage war with a ferocity and effectiveness that totalitarian regimes could only envy. In the years after the war, as the world struggled to rebuild and make sense of the carnage, historians and veterans alike tried to identify the turning points, the weapons, the decisions that had made victory possible. Some pointed to the atomic bomb, the ultimate expression of American scientific and industrial power. Others to the Sherman tank, which, despite its flaws, was produced in such quantities that it overwhelmed the technically superior German armor. Still others pointed to the P-51 Mustang, which won air superiority over Europe, or the Liberty ship, which kept the supply lines open across the Atlantic, or the proximity fuse, which revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare. All of these were vital. All of these played crucial roles in the Allied victory. But for the men who fought on the ground, who advanced through hedgerows and forests and city streets, who cleared bunkers and took hills and held positions against desperate counterattacks, there was another weapon that mattered just as much. If not more, it was the gun that fired from miles away, that destroyed the enemy before he could kill you, that never let you down and never ran out of ammunition. It was the Long Tom. And its contribution to victory, while less celebrated than more glamorous weapons, was absolutely fundamental to the way the war was won. The Long Tom allowed American commanders to fight a different kind of war. It allowed them to husband their infantry, to avoid the kind of frontal assaults that had characterized World War I and had led to such appalling casualties. It allowed them to reduce fortified positions methodically without sacrificing thousands of lives in direct assaults. It allowed them to break up enemy counterattacks before they developed, to destroy supply lines deep in enemy territory, to make the battlefield a place where American firepower, rather than American bodies, bore the burden of victory. This was not the war the Germans expected to fight. They had trained for a war of maneuver, of tactical brilliance, of small, highly trained units achieving decisive results through superior skill and determination. The Long Tom made that kind of war impossible. It forced the Germans to fight an attritional struggle, a war of material and industrial capacity, a war they could not win, and when German soldiers, huddled in their bunkers, heard the distant boom and felt the earth tremble and waited for the inevitable explosion, they understood a truth that their leaders had refused to accept, that the United States of America, that sprawling, chaotic industrial democracy, had produced a weapon they could not match, could not counter, and could not escape. And in that understanding, buried deep in the concrete and steel of their failing fortifications, the outcome of the war was written. The Long Tom did not win World War II alone. No single weapon ever does. Wars are won by nations, by the combined efforts of millions of people working toward a common goal. They are won by factory workers and farmers, by scientists and engineers, by sailors and airmen and soldiers, by the accumulated weight of industrial production and national will. But the Long Tom was there, in every theater, at every critical moment, speaking with a voice of thunder and steel. And its message was clear, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. America had come to fight. And America had brought the tools to finish the job. In the end, that was what the Long Tom represented. Not cruelty, not mindless destruction, not the wholesale slaughter that artillery had represented in the trenches of World War I, but something different, something more surgical, more precise, more devastating in its effect. It represented the quiet, relentless competence of a nation that, once roused to war, would see it through to the end. A nation that would build the guns, train the crews, ship the ammunition, and fire until the enemy had no choice but to surrender. A nation that understood that wars are not won by individual heroism or tactical brilliance alone, but by the sustained application of overwhelming force, applied with precision and maintained without pause until victory is achieved. That is the legacy of the 150-millimeter gun M1. That is the story of the Long Tom, a weapon that Germany never saw coming, a weapon that once it arrived, they could never forget, a weapon that changed the nature of modern warfare and proved beyond any doubt that American industrial power could be transformed into battlefield dominance. And in the silence that followed the last shell, in the ruins of bunkers and fortresses and cities across Europe and the Pacific, there remained only the echo of American thunder, and the proof that freedom, when defended by such means and such men, would prevail against any tyranny, no matter how powerful it seemed at its zenith. The guns fell silent in May 1945 in Europe, and in August 1945 in the Pacific, but their lesson endures. Power without purpose is meaningless, but purpose, backed by overwhelming material strength and the will to use it without hesitation, is unstoppable. The Long Tom proved that truth, one shell at a time, across 2 oceans and 3 continents. And the world has never forgotten.